Hello everybody, welcome back to another video, and in today's video, I'm going to be simulating a dinosaur ecosystem for 100 days. Let's get right into the first day. On day 1, I created a herd of triceratopses, and they seemed to be thriving until I introduced the first predator of the ecosystem, the velociraptor. The triceratopses were doing well, but not for long. For the velociraptors on the other side of the map were making their way towards the triceratopses' territory. But luckily enough, it was just a bluff charge. The velociraptor was only looking for water. But this time, the triceratopses might not be so lucky. The velociraptors were making their way towards the triceratopses, and it seemed that the triceratopses didn't even know that they were right behind them. But one velociraptor couldn't kill off a herd of triceratopses. But he might be able to call in some of his friends. Now this velociraptor was the alpha of the pack. But the velociraptor got into a battle with the triceratops, but he called in his friends. It was only a matter of time until the whole velociraptor pack decided to show up and take the triceratopses out of the picture. But little did they know, on the other side of the island, the ankylosauruses were getting ready to join the ecosystem. The ankylosauruses were almost like tanks. They got into huge battles with the carnivorous predators and were able to fend off with their giant club-like tails. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, the velociraptors were making their move and slowly stalking the triceratopses. And it seemed that the triceratopses were going to the watering hole, yet the velociraptors were following them, and I don't think they were looking for water this time. And then, in the middle of all of that, the gallimimuses were making their way. Yet, they have to be careful, because they're an easy prey for the velociraptors. Meanwhile, the ankylosauruses were thriving, and they weren't being bothered by any of the predators. Back to the gallimimus. One of them have already died. Yet the struthiomimus still decided to make his way into the ecosystem. And the gallimimus have already gone extinct in the ecosystem. And so has the struthiomimus, being killed by the exact same velociraptor. It seemed that the velociraptors were socializing, almost planning a plan to take down the triceratopses, or maybe another species. Night was approaching, and little did any of the dinosaurs know, it was about to descend into chaos. On the other side of the island, the Edmontosaurus was coming out at possibly the worst time of the day. Well, at least for this dinosaur. All the herbivores and velociraptors were gathered around the watering hole, seemed peaceful. Little did they know, a predator bigger and stronger than all of them combined was about to show. In the morning, that is, for this beast was resting. Morning was just around the corner, and it seemed everyone had survived just fine through the night. But on the other side of the island, something menacing and powerful was lurking. The Carnotaurus. It was officially morning, and lucky enough for the other dinosaurs, none of them have died yet. It seemed that the Triceratops and Velociraptor had gotten into a fight, but there were bigger things to worry about, literally. The Carnotaurus had shown up to the watering hole, where it seemed pretty peaceful, and it didn't seem that the Carnotaurus was going to change it, but not for long. And back to the Triceratopses, they seemed to be socializing deep, but they weren't socializing at the water hole, which leads me to believe the Carnotaurus was scaring them away. Meanwhile, a brave Triceratops was in the middle of a battle with a Carnotaurus. Sadly enough, the Triceratops was at low health. And, well, you'll see. And the Carnotaurus won the fight. But he did not win the war. Meanwhile, the Velociraptor was taking a nap. And our Edmontosaurus is still managing to stay alive. Back at the watering hole, the Carnotaurus was still managing his ground. And, well, it seemed that the Triceratopses weren't trying to bug him after they saw what happened to their friend. The other Carnotaurus was sneaking up on an unsuspecting Triceratops. The Triceratops ended up surviving. Meanwhile, the Velociraptors ended up claiming a portion of the island. And if anything goes into their territory, there's a good chance they're not coming out of it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, the Carnotaurus was stirring up some trouble with the Ankylosaurs. Unlike the Ankylosaurs, this was the end for the Edmontosaurus. The Edmontosaurus was dead. And the other Edmontosaurus had been killed by the Velociraptor. Officially, the Edmontosaurs were extinct. Meanwhile, the Ceratosaurus was at the watering hole and caught a whiff of a Triceratops. The Triceratops had died, and it seemed that there was nothing on this island that could stop the wrath of the Carnotauruses. Meanwhile, the Ankylosaurs were just relaxing on their own portion of land with no one bothering them. Or at least, that's what they thought. There was a Carnotaurus stalking them. Meanwhile, on the island, the Dilophosauruses decided to come out and play. Now it was nighttime, and the Dilophosaurus and the Velociraptor ran into each other. And the Triceratopses were still thriving. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, the Carnotaurus was charging towards the watering hole. And as always, the Ankylosaurs were doing great. But on the other side of the island, the Dilophosaur and a Velociraptor were in a major battle. But who will come out on top? And for the first time, the Ankylosaurus was in a battle with the Carnotaurus. The Velociraptor ended up sealing the victory, and the same goes for the Carnotaurus. Meanwhile, the other Ankylosaurs seemed lonely, and both of the Ceratosauruses are in the same facility as the Ankylosaurus. In this moment, all hope seemed lost for the Ankylosaurs. Meanwhile, the Carnotauruses decided to come back for a second round. But then retreated. On the other side of the island, little did they know, a brand new predator was coming into the ecosystem. The Ceratosaurus. This brand new predator, the Ceratosaurus, would become one of the most fierce and feared dinosaurs on this island. Meanwhile, the Dilophosaurus was watching from a safe distance. Meanwhile, the Ankylosaurus is the last of its kind and hiding from the Carnotauruses and the brand new Ceratosaurus, which is approaching him with great speed. Thankfully, the Ceratosaurus was only going for the dead Ankylosaurus. Meanwhile, the Triceratopses were not only living, but thriving, as always. And back to the Ankylosaurus, a Carnotaurus was watching him from the distance. The Ankylosaurus heard the Carnotaurus's loud roar and started charging. It was only a bluff charge to scare away the Carnotaurus, but it worked. So far, the last Ankylosaurus is able to stand its ground pretty well. And the Velociraptors, as always, are still pretty fierce. Not the top of the food chain, but also not the bottom. Back to the Ankylosaurus, he was having lunch while a Ceratosaurus was watching. The Ceratosaurus is approaching, and the Ankylosaurus is trying its best to hide behind the bush, and it seems to be working. And luckily enough, the Ceratosaurus went to sleep so the Ankylosaurus can escape in time. But not if the Carnotaurus has anything to say about it. The other Carnotaurus has showed up, and yet the two Carnotauruses begin to fight as the Ankylosaurus runs away. Two allies, two of the same species, two Carnotauruses, fight to see who will be the alpha. The gray Carnotaurus ends up winning, and back at the Triceratopses, they're socializing. Meanwhile, the Ankylosaurus is being stalked by a Ceratosaurus once again. Later that evening, the Ceratosaurus challenged the Ankylosaurus to a fight. He accepts. And that's it for the Ankylosauruses. They're extinct. Or at least, that's what we thought. Another Ankylosaurus has hidden on the outskirts of the island and finally has made his way into the main watering hole. The last Dilophosaurus still strong, and the remaining 3 Triceratopses still staying for the long run. And a brand new species, the Brachiosaurus, is being introduced to the island. Meanwhile, a Dilophosaurus and a Velociraptor began to battle. Meanwhile, the Carnotaurus and Ceratosauruses were fighting. Who will come out on top, the fierce Ceratosaurus or the strong and mighty Carnotaurus? The Ceratosaurus was managed to kill the Carnotaurus. But was this really the end of the Carnotaurus' legacy? Meanwhile, the Brachiosaurus was taking a drink in the watering hole. And meanwhile, our final Ankylosaurus was hiding in the kind of swampy area of the island. And our Velociraptors were doing great. And to answer the question from earlier, the Carnotaurus' wrath was not over, for the second Carnotaurus still remains. And the second Carnotaurus still seems to scare the inhabitants of the island. And the Triceratopses were doing great. And the powerful Ceratosaurus is challenging the Ankylosaurus to a battle. It seemed the Ankylosaurs were officially done. Well, extinct, if you will. The Ankylosaurus just wasn't managed to stay alive through the night. Meanwhile, a brand new species was introduced, the Sinoceratops. The Sinoceratopses seemed to be looking for a source of food. And finally, they found it, right by the watering hole. Meanwhile, a Triceratops was fighting a Carnotaurus. Well, the last Carnotaurus. The Carnotaurus was able to defeat the Triceratops. And now, there is only 2 Triceratopses remaining. And the Carnotaurus was still healing from the battle. And, of course, the Sinoceratopses were great. But not for long. The Carnotaurus had challenged the Sinoceratops to a battle to the death. It seemed that this Sinoceratops's days were over. Meanwhile, a Ceratosaurus and another Sinoceratops were battling it out. But this time, this Sinoceratops was the last of its kind. Now, the Sinoceratopses were officially extinct. And a brand new species was introduced to the island, the Maiasaura. And the Maiasaura seemed to like its habitat. And the Brachiosauruses were doing just fine. Meanwhile, the Maiasaura made its way to the other side of the island and found a good food source. And once again, the Ceratosaurus challenges a fight to the Carnotaurus. Could this be the end of the Carnotaurus' reign of terror? The Ceratosaurus actually did it. He was managed to end the wrath of the Carnotauruses. Meanwhile, a brand new species was introduced, the Stegosaurus. And the Maiasaura died its watery demise. And the same can be said for the other Maiasaura. Night is approaching fast, so the dinosaurs need to prepare. The island was in peace, but not for long, for something sinister and murderous was about to come. A brand new species, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. The Tyrannosaurus Rex was approaching the watering hole. Meanwhile, a Ceratosaurus was fighting a Triceratops, and in the background, a Tyrannosaurus Rex fights the last Triceratops. The Ceratosaurus was able to take down the Triceratops. And the same can be said for the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Meanwhile, a brand new species was being released, a Spinosaurus. And the Spinosaurus made his way towards the Stegosauruses. The Spinosaurus drinks from the watering hole with a long, alligator-like mouth. Meanwhile, in the morning, a Spinosaurus fights a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Things seemed bad for the Spinosaurus. And as I suspected, the Tyrannosaurus Rex came out on top. But you can't forget about the Ceratosaurus, the one who ended the Carnotaurus' reign of fear. The Stegosauruses were panicking. And as always, the Velociraptors were doing great. And the Ceratosaurus was fighting one of the remaining two Triceratopses. the Ceratosaurus managed to win. And the velociraptors started to retreat from the watering hole. And as a velociraptor was killing some of the wildlife, a stegosaurus was charging. Meanwhile, a brand new species was introduced. And the new species was fighting the Ceratosaurus. I have no clue how, but the Ceratosaurus was able to win. It seemed that the Ceratosaurus and the T-Rex were dominating all. The morning was approaching, and for the Ceratosaurus, the night was a successful hunt. Meanwhile, a brand new species was introduced, the Hyungosaurus. Immediately, he went to get a drink of water. And so, we've simulated a successful ecosystem of humble sauropods, fierce and feared hunters, to dinosaurs who didn't last too long, to dinosaurs who were here for the long haul. And it is a very successful ecosystem. To the top of the food chain, dinosaurs like the Ceratosaurus, T-Rex, and Carnotaurus. To the bottom, like the Struthiomimus, Edmontosaurus, and Gallimimus. Thank you for watching today's video. So long, folks. Goodbye.